They called her cursed. They said she drove her own husband to his grave. A whole town had already decided who she was before she ever spoke a single word. But a 7-year-old boy, who hadn't laughed in 14 months, saw something in her that everyone else refused to look for. Welcome to a channel where the West is told the way it truly was, through the grit of women who refuse to break, the love of fathers learning to live again. This story teaches us that the most powerful thing you can do in a world that has written you off is simply stay and let the truth speak for itself. If this story hit close to home, hit that like, drop a comment, and subscribe. Now let's begin.
The town of Redstone Crossing, Wyoming was a hard place, where a man's worth was in his herd, and a woman's was in how quiet she could be. Clara June Whitmore was never good at being quiet. She arrived just 3 weeks after they pulled her husband Roy's body from a collapsed mine. 3 weeks of folks in Caldwell Falls looking at her sideways, whispering the word cursed just loud enough for her to hear. 3 weeks of neighbors not calling anymore. Roy was gone, and somehow, in the cruel math of a small town, that had become her fault. The resettlement office found her a place doing domestic work at the Rains Ranch, 6 miles east of town. Clean the house, cook the meals, and keep the boy. That is what the letter said. Keep the boy. Like young Ezra Rains was a dwindling fire. She did not expect a market day when the stage arrived. She did not expect half the town to be staring as she stepped down with her one trunk. "Is that her?" A woman's voice cut through the air. "The Whitmore widow," another answered. A short pause followed. "They say her husband went into that mine perfectly healthy. They say she fought with him that morning, something fierce." Clara just looked for the land office. The letter said to find a man named Cole Rains, a former marshal. "Excuse me, ma'am," she asked a passing woman. "Could you tell me where the land office is?" The woman looked Clara up and down, sizing her up. Clara was a sturdy woman, built strong like her people. She knew that look all too well. "End of the street," the woman said, and hurried on. As Clara neared the office, a woman in a fine gray dress stepped right in her path. She was about 50, with a face that had once been pretty but had soured over time. "You're the woman from Caldwell Falls," she stated. "I am," Clara replied, not breaking her stride. "I am Dorothea Vale. My husband owns most of this town. I want you to understand something before you go through with this." Clara stopped and turned, looking at the woman with the kind of patience that only comes when you have nothing left to lose. "Cole Rains is a good man," Dorothea said. "He and that boy have suffered enough. The last woman sent out there lasted 11 days. The one before that, not even a week." Her eyes swept over Clara again. "I do not know what they were thinking, sending a woman with your reputation." "My husband died in a mine," Clara said flatly. "That's my history." "Your husband died 3 days after the whole town heard you two screaming at each other in the street," Dorothea shot back. "People remember things like that." "People remember what they want to," Clara replied. Dorothea stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low warning. "Go back where you came from. Cole Rains doesn't need your kind of trouble, and neither does that poor broken child." Clara just looked at her for a long moment, then picked up her trunk and walked right past her into the land office. The man inside was young and nervous. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I have an arrangement with Mr. Cole Rains." "Yes, ma'am," the clerk stammered. "Mr. Rains is, waiting out back. He does not come inside much." "All right, then." She went back outside and found him by the side of the building. Cole Rains was leaned against a hitching post, his hat pulled low. He watched her approach as if he was not sure she was real. He was built lean and tough like a wire fence, with dark eyes and a hard-set jaw that gave nothing away. He did not say a word. Clara set her trunk down and waited. Finally, he spoke. "You're a bigger woman than I expected." She looked him square in the eye. "And you're shorter on manners than I expected." Something flickered in his eyes, almost a smile. "Fair enough. Do you know what you're getting into?" Domestic work. And the boy, Ezra, she said. He said the name like it hurt him. My son is 7 years old. He has not slept through the night since his mother passed 14 months ago. He talks all the time, from sunup to sundown. But he will not tell you one true thing. You ask him how he is, he'll tell you about the clouds. Cole's jaw tightened. The doctors say it is grief. They say to wait. I've been waiting for 14 months. What happened to his mother? Clara asked softly. Cole's eyes went cold. She died giving birth. The baby died too. Ezra saw the whole thing. Clara was quiet. I'm sorry. I don't need sorry, he said. I need someone who can hold this place together and won't run when things get hard. Everybody runs. Not everybody, she said. He looked at her for a long time, then gave a single nod, grabbed her trunk, and loaded it onto the wagon. They rode the 6 miles mostly in silence, the land cold and gray under the November sky. When they were about a mile from the ranch, Cole finally spoke. 2 rules. All right. First, don't push Ezra. He will tell you he is fine. He is not. Pushing only makes it worse. And second, Cole hesitated. Do not make him any promises you can't keep. He's had enough folks leave him. Clara turned to look at him, but he was staring straight ahead. I don't make promises I can't keep, she said. He said nothing back. The ranch was simple, a place that was being maintained but not lived in. The house was solid, but there were no curtains, no welcome mat, nothing that made it a home. Ezra was standing on the porch. He was small for a boy of 7, with a mess of dark curls and eyes that seemed too big for his face. He watched Clara with a look she could not quite figure out. Cole climbed down. Ezra, come say hello. The boy came to the edge of the steps and looked up at Clara. A hawk came this morning, he said. It got a rabbit right by that fence post. The rabbit never saw it coming. Did you know hawks can dive almost 100 miles an hour? The hawk ate everything but the back feet. I do not know why it left the feet. Clara climbed down from the wagon. The step was high, and she landed hard on the frozen ground, her skirt catching for a moment on the wheel. She showed no shame for falling, not a bit. She just got to her feet, brushed off her skirt, and looked straight at young Ezra. I have never seen a hawk take a rabbit, she told him. I reckon I could have watched that all day. The boy blinked. Most folks find that sort of thing gruesome. Well, most folks do not pay attention to how the world really is. Cole's voice cut in, sharp as a tack. Ezra, that is enough. It is all right, Clara said gently. I take after my grandma. She was strong enough to haul a grown calf out of a snowdrift, so I never saw it as a weakness. Ezra thought on that. What is a weakness? Something that holds you back. Oh, he looked at her a moment. You want to see where the hawk left the rabbit's feet? Clara smiled. Sure. From behind, Cole made a sound of disapproval, but she followed the boy to the fence post. The kitchen was a disaster. One look told Clara it had been neglected for months. Food was shoved in the pantry any which way, and a cast-iron pan was caked with old black grease. She said nothing, just got to work. While she cooked, Cole sat at the table, pretending to read but watching her every move. Ezra was on the floor, tying knots in a rope. That water pump out east is mighty stiff, Clara said. I know. I will need it working to do laundry tomorrow. Cole replied, I will fix it tonight. She stirred the pot. Do y'all have any preferences for supper? I eat what is put in front of me. Ezra looked up from his rope. I do not like parsnips, and I do not like runny eggs. Cole made a sound. I make them the way they cook fastest. That is not the same as tasting best, Clara said mildly. She is right, P., Ezra said, sounding pleased. I know she is right, Cole snapped. She kept her peace and saw the small smile on Ezra's face. Supper was simple salt pork, beans, and fresh biscuits. Clara knew the exact moment Cole took a bite of food that was cooked with real care. He did not say a word, but the way he ate told her everything. Ezra mentioned that Judge Croft's family was one of the first in Redstone Crossing. He said the judge let him read the old town records. Is he a fair man, Judge Croft? Clara asked. A quiet fell over the table. Cole just stared at his son. "He seems nice," Ezra said carefully. "He gives me peppermint sometimes." Cole's face was like stone. Clara took note and put more biscuits on the table without another word. Later, after Ezra went to wash up, Cole stood in the kitchen doorway as she cleaned. "You do not have to do all that tonight," he said. "I do not sleep well in a new place," she answered. "It is better to work." He leaned against the frame. "You are going to hear Ezra tonight. He wakes up most nights." "Does he come to you?" Cole's jaw tightened. "He used to, not anymore." "Why not?" "Because about 6 months ago, I was not in any shape to be helpful. He found me that way. He has not come to my room since." The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. "He still needs someone," she said softly. "He needs to learn to sleep on his own. He is 7 years old, Mr. Raines." Cole's tired eyes met hers. "I know how old he is. A child should not have to be alone in the dark just because the grown-ups need him to be brave." The silence stretched on. "Do what you think is right," he said finally. "Just do not make him rely on you and then leave. That is all I ask." He then walked down the hall. Clara stood with her hands in the dishwater, listening to the house settle. It was long after midnight when she heard Ezra not crying but pacing. His small footsteps went back and forth like a caged animal. Clara remembered Cole's warning, but she knew there was a difference between pushing and just being there. She got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went to the boy's door. She knocked softly. "Ezra." The pacing stopped. "I cannot sleep either," she said through the wood. "I am going to heat some milk if you would like some." There was only silence. "You do not have to talk. You can just sit with me." After a long moment, the door creaked open. Ezra stood there, his hair a mess, his eyes looking far too old for his face. "Warm milk has tryptophan," he said. "It is a chemical that helps you sleep. I read it in one of P's books." "Then it ought to work on the both of us," Clara said with a small smile. In the kitchen, they sat in comfortable silence as she heated the milk. "Do you think dead people know when you are thinking about them?" Ezra asked suddenly. Clara paused. "I do. I think they feel it, even after a long, long time. My mother has been dead 14 months and 11 days. "I know," she said softly. "P does not talk about her. I think saying her name hurts him too much. But she was real. She was real, was she not?" Clara's heart ached for the small boy. "She was absolutely real," she said. "You are still here, and I bet you have her eyes, or her way of seeing things. People do not stop being real just because we stop talking about them." Ezra was perfectly still. "Her name was Margaret," he whispered. But P called her Maggie. The way he said it was half fear and half relief, like touching something he thought would burn but finding it was only warm. "Maggie," Clara repeated gently. "That is a fine name." Ezra nodded and finished his milk. Soon his eyes grew heavy, and she walked him back to his bed. As she turned to leave, she saw Cole standing in the hallway. He just watched her, his face showing a look of pure, unguarded relief, like a man who just realized help had finally come. Neither of them said a word. Clara just met his gaze steadily before returning to her room. The next morning, she noticed two things. First, the water pump outside was fixed and running smooth. Second, a single old pressed wildflower sat on the kitchen windowsill. She left it right where it was. She made a breakfast of biscuits, salt pork, and eggs cooked firm the way Ezra liked them. When the boy came into the kitchen, he said, "P fixed the pump last night. I heard him out there at 2 in the morning. He does things at night when he thinks no one is watching." "Does he now?" Clara said. "He thinks if he does them quiet enough, they do not count." Clara poured coffee for Cole and looked out the window. "Some folks show how they feel by what they do, not what they say. That does not mean it does not count." Ezra thought about that. "Like how you heated milk last night." Clara looked at him and understood. This boy, for all his chatter, missed nothing at all. He was watching everything. That little boy, Ezra, tried to make sense of the world after his mama died. He paid close attention to every little thing, hoping it would explain what he had lost. His father, Cole, walked in from the barn and just froze in the doorway. He saw his son at the table, eating with a real appetite for the first time in ages. Cole looked at Clara, who just handed him his coffee. She told him the pump was working fine, and he mumbled a thank you. He sat down and watched Ezra tell a story about a sheepdog he had read about. For just a second, Cole's hard face softened. It looked so much like hope that Clara had to turn away quick, back to the stove. Outside, a north wind was kicking up, bringing the first real snow down from the mountains. Clara felt the chill seep up through the floorboards. She poked the fire, thinking about what Dorothy Vale had said in town, telling her to go back where she came from. She remembered her last morning with her husband Roy, and the fight she could never take back. She thought about that mine bell ringing an hour later. She remembered the folks in Caldwell Falls treating her like she was the one who brought death to her own house. People would step away from her in the store, and even the preacher's wife wouldn't meet her eyes. She pictured that 7-year-old boy, Ezra, pacing his room in the dark, wondering if his mother was still real. Clara turned back to the stove and started making more biscuits. There was no going back to where she came from. She knew that when she first read the letter that said, "One child in need of care," she was already right where she was supposed to be. She just didn't know the price yet. The snow hit hard and stayed, blanketing the whole valley. Clara started to learn the ranch by its sounds and feelings. She learned which floorboards groaned, which door always stuck, and how the old stove liked its fire. She learned Ezra's ways, too. He always woke up before Cole, coming to the kitchen not for food, but to escape the quiet of his own room as the sun came up. He said his mama always had coffee on. She always had something cooking, but never made a big deal about it. "You beat me to it again," Ezra said on the fourth morning, hopping into his chair. Clara told him she never slept well in new places. He pulled his knees to his chest, balancing perfectly. "Pa says you'll be gone by the end of the month, just like the others," he said. Clara stopped what she was doing. "Did he say that to you?" "No," Ezra said, looking her straight in the eye. "He said it to Deputy Bell. I heard him from the barn. Are you going to leave?" "No," Clara said simply. "How do you know?" "Because I'm not finished with what I came to do." "What's that?" Ezra asked. "Making sure your eggs aren't runny," she told him. He almost smiled. That morning, Cole didn't say a word to her. But later, he came in and stood by the door, just watching her show Ezra how to roll out biscuit dough. With the boy's hands all focused and a little flour on his nose, Cole stood there so long that Clara finally spoke without even looking at him. "There's coffee on the stove, Mr. Raines." He poured a cup and sat down. "You don't have to do that with him." "I know," she said. "It's not part of the deal." "Neither's fixing a water pump at 2 in the morning," she shot back, "but here we are." There was a long pause, then he said quietly, "Fair point." Ezra watched them both, taking it all in. On the 6th day, Clara drove the wagon into Redstone Crossing for supplies, and finally understood what she had walked into. Cole had offered to come, but she told him she'd be fine. She was loading flour at the Mercantile when Dorothea Vale walked in with 2 other women. They looked like they had already made up their minds about something. "Miss Whitmore," Dorothea said, her voice all sweet and pleasant, but you couldn't tell what was behind it. "How are you settling in out at the Raines place?" "Fine, thank you," Clara replied. "And that poor child Ezra," she said, her sympathy sounding practiced. "We've all been so worried." "He's doing well," Clara said. Another woman with a sour look spoke up. "We were so relieved when the office sent someone new, after the last 2 left so quick." She paused, then looked right at Clara with plain unkindness. "Folks are saying you're the woman who drove her own husband into a mine shaft, then took the settlement money." The whole store went quiet. Mr. Puit behind the counter suddenly got real interested in his paperwork. Clara set down the sack of flour and faced the woman. Her voice was steady. "I didn't drive my husband anywhere," she said. Roy Whitmore went into that mine every morning for 4 years. The company knew the shaft was unsafe. They paid me a settlement because they were responsible, and because $200 was cheaper for them than a lawsuit. She picked the flour sack back up. You can write to Caldwell Falls if you need to check my story. On the long, cold drive back to the ranch, she let the weight of their cruelty sink in. They said it like it was a simple fact. When she pulled the wagon into the yard, Cole was at the corral talking to a stranger. This man was well-dressed and carried himself with an air of authority. Cole's face changed the second he saw her pull in. "Miss Whitmore," Cole said as she climbed down, "this is Judge Harlan Croft." The judge turned, his face open and pleasant, but something felt off. Judge Croft had a way of looking trustworthy that set a person on edge. He tipped his hat with a practiced smile. "Miss Whitmore, your reputation precedes you." Clara met his gaze. "I imagine it does." He gestured toward the ranch. "All good things, I assure you. I was just telling Cole how relieved I am that young Ezra has someone stable in his life. That boy's had a rough go of it." "He has," Clara agreed. Croft clapped Cole on the shoulder. "This one here works himself to the bone. Too stubborn to ask for a hand. He wouldn't ask for water if his boots were on fire." Croft chuckled, but Cole's face remained like stone. Cole's voice was flat. "The judge has been kind to Ezra. Just looking out for a neighbor's son," Croft said smoothly, his eyes sizing Clara up. "I hear you're from Caldwell Falls. A real shame about your husband. That mining life is hard on folks." He nodded. "Well, I'll let you two be. Cole, you think on my offer." He gave Clara another tip of his hat and drove off in his buggy. Once the dust settled, Clara turned to Cole. "What offer was that?" Cole stared down the empty road. "He wants to buy the east pasture. Says he needs more land for his cattle. Is this the first he's asked?" After a moment, Cole said, "The third." Clara watched him. "And you're not selling?" "No." "Does he know that?" "He knows." Cole finally turned, his jaw tight. "Croft is a patient man. He doesn't push. He just circles like a buzzard, waiting for the right time." He looked right at her. "Keep Ezra clear of him." "Why is that?" Cole chose his words carefully. "Croft is always generous with Ezra. Gives him candy, books. The boy doesn't get much attention from anyone else, and Croft knows it." He paused. "I won't have my son used as a pawn." "A pawn for what?" "For whatever he wants that I'm not giving him." Cole headed for the barn. "Bring that flour inside before the dew settles on it." But Clara lingered, thinking about Croft's calculating stare. It was the look a man gives something he ain't yet figured out how to use. Ezra came into the kitchen well past midnight, his eyes red and puffy. He sat at the table with the quiet emptiness of a child who had cried himself out. Clara put a pan of milk on the stove and sat with him. "I dreamed of Mama," he finally whispered. "Was it a bad dream?" He shook his head. "Not bad. She was just in our old kitchen. She was making bread, and I kept trying to talk to her, but she couldn't hear me. It was like there was a wall of glass between us." He stared at his small hands. "I kept knocking, but she just kept smiling and kneading the dough." Clara placed a warm cup of milk in front of him. "I think that dream means you miss her so much that even the happy memories have a little hurt in them." Ezra wrapped his hands around the cup. "Papi don't know I dream about her. I don't want to make him sad. He's already sad all the time. I see it when he looks at me, like I remind him of something." "You remind him of her," Clara said gently. "And that's not a bad thing, even when it stings." Ezra's voice was suddenly fierce. "He should say her name. She was real. He should say her name out loud." "You are right," Clara said. "Then why won't he?" Clara looked at the 7-year-old boy, who understood grief better than most grown men. She answered him slowly. "Sometimes when we lose someone we love that much, saying their name is like opening a door we've been fighting to keep shut." We're afraid all the pain will come flooding out, and we won't be able to shut it again." She paused. "That's not being weak. That's just being human." Ezra looked at her. "Are you afraid like that?" "Yes," Clara admitted softly. "Afraid of saying out loud that I'm lonely, that I've been lonely for a long, long time, and I don't know what to do about it." Ezra thought this over with great seriousness. "That sounds hard." "It is," she said. He drank his milk. "I don't think you'll be lonely here," he said finally. "Poppy ain't much for talking, but he watches you. When you're cooking or feeding the chickens. He watched you fix that gate hinge all by yourself last week." He set his cup down. "I think watching means something." "Go on to bed, Ezra," Clara said, her voice a little thick. At the doorway, he turned back. "Miss Whitmore, that dried flower on the windowsill, that was my mama's. She picked it the summer before. I put it there to keep it safe." He looked at her. "I'm glad you left it be." Clara sat alone in the quiet kitchen long after he'd gone. 2 days later, Cole came home from town, his face set like a granite stone. He waited until Ezra was asleep. He sat at the table and put his hands flat on the wood. "There's talk," he said, his voice low. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that starts with the town gossips and ends with words like unfit and unsuitable." He looked up, his eyes hard. "Croft mentioned it to me, casual-like. Said some of the ladies in town are worried about the arrangement here, about a woman like you living under my roof with my boy. He said he was only bringing it up because he'd hate to see any trouble for me," Cole said, his voice level with a cold fury. "He said if I needed to make other arrangements, he would be more than happy to take Ezra in for a spell, until things got sorted out." The threat hung in the air between them. "He wants Ezra," Clara said. "He wants the east pasture," Cole corrected her. "Ezra is just his way of getting it. I told him no. I told him you were staying." Cole walked to the window. "He just smiled. That's the smile that worries me." "What do you think he'll do?" "I don't know. That's the problem with a man like Croft. You never see the strike coming." He turned from the window. "I need you to know what you're in the middle of, Miss Whitmore. This man has been trying to run me off this land for 2 years. First with offers, then my bank loan got difficult. Croft is on the bank's board. Then my best ranch hand up and quit. Now he's found you. A new angle to work." Clara met his stare without flinching. "I understand. I am not asking you to leave," he said, his voice clear. "I am telling you the truth of it. Most folks, when they hear it, they decide the trouble ain't worth the pay." He paused. "The last 2 housekeepers who left, I don't hold it against them. I should have told them what they were walking into." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Did you tell them about Ezra's mother? About what he saw?" Cole's face tightened. "No." "Did you tell them about Croft?" "No." "Then you weren't being honest," she said, stating it as a simple fact. He took that in. "No, I wasn't." "Well," Clara said, her voice steady, "you've told me the truth now, and I am still sitting in this chair." A new look passed over Cole's face, one she couldn't quite decipher. It was the look of a man who'd just had a wall knocked down without his permission. He said nothing more, just put on his coat and went out for his nightly check of the barn. Clara stayed at the table, the warm lamplight shining on the fragile, stubborn flower on the windowsill. "The trouble, you know, has a way of showing up on a Wednesday quiet as a mouse and dressed up like it belongs." For Clara Whitmore, it rode into the yard with Deputy Rufus Bell. After 10 days in Redstone Crossing, a powerful man had decided she was a problem that needed solving. Plain and simple. This whole mess was about to show that some folks will twist the truth to take what is not theirs. But Clara wasn't afraid. She had learned a long time ago that fear is just a feeling, not a final judgment. What really matters is what you do after that feeling passes. And she had already made up her mind about what she was going to do next. She knew the deputy, a 60-year-old man with careful eyes that had seen too much to be surprised. But this time, he did not tip his hat. He just stood there holding it in his hands, looking like a man who had to deliver news he wished he did not have. He told them Judge Croft had called a welfare hearing, said he was concerned about the boy Ezra's safety and moral upbringing. The deputy paused, then looked right at Clara. The concerns were specifically about her presence there. The hearing was set for Friday, just 2 days away. Croft had 3 local women ready to speak against her, and he had even dug up some story about her past from an office back in Cheyenne. Cole came out of the barn then. He took one look at the deputy's face and knew something was wrong. As Belle laid it all out, a cold stillness settled over Cole. It was the kind of stillness a man gets when a blow he has been expecting for a long time finally lands. When Belle finished, Cole said flatly that Croft could not take Ezra. The deputy shook his head. He was not trying to take the boy, not officially. He was just making it so the court had to decide if Ezra's home was suitable. If they decided it was not, the court could appoint a new guardian, and Croft had already volunteered for the job. Cole stood there in the quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and looked straight at Clara. "You do not have to be at that hearing," he said. "Yes, I do," she answered, her voice just as steady as his. It was the first time he had ever used her given name, and the sound of it hung in the air between them. "If I am not there," she told him, "then I have already lost, and so have you." Before he left, Deputy Bell added one more thing. He said Dr. Agnes Ford knew about the hearing. She had told him to tell Cole that she was coming, and he should not even try to talk her out of it. For the first time, a flicker of something that was not ice moved in Cole's eyes. After the deputy rode off, Clara asked for the real story. Cole leaned against the fence, looking out at the east pasture that had started all this trouble. He told her that years ago, when he was a marshal, he had arrested a rancher named Ellis Hatch for rustling cattle. The evidence seemed solid, and Judge Croft had presided over the trial that sent Hatch to prison. The man died there 8 months later. But 2 years after that, the real cattle thief was caught and confessed to everything. It turned out the evidence against Hatch had been completely faked. Croft had wanted Hatch's land all along. Once Hatch was in prison, Croft bought the land from his desperate wife for next to nothing. Cole's voice was flat with no pity for himself. "I was the one who arrested him," he said. "I testified at that trial. I handed Croft everything he needed." He turned to face Clara. "You have to understand, Croft does not hate you. He does not even know you. You are just a tool that fits the job he is trying to do. That is what makes him dangerous. You cannot argue with a man who feels nothing." "Then we do not argue," Clara said, her voice firm. "We give that room something it cannot just move around." She laid out her plan. "Croft built this whole case on a story about who I am. He says I'm a bad influence, a danger to your son. That story only works as long as nobody in that room really knows me." She paused. "And more importantly, they do not know Ezra. This whole hearing is about his welfare, but not one person has bothered to see him as a real child. They are going to see him on Friday. That boy deserves to be seen for who he is." Cole turned back to the fence, quiet for a long, long time. He knew the risks if this went wrong. But he also heard the undeniable truth in her words. "I understand, Cole. I know what is on the line." She stood near him, giving him space but showing her support. "I have been the woman who walks into a room and finds a jury of folks who have already passed judgment. I know that feeling down in my bones. And I know what it takes to stand tall in the middle of all that and say, 'No, you look again. You look closer, because I am more than the tale you have spun about me.'" She took a breath. "That is what I aim to do on Friday. For me and for Ezra, too, if you will have me." Cole was silent for a long spell. Then he spoke, his voice low. "He said something last night. He said he had a dream you were leaving, and he was so relieved when he woke up to find you still here." Cole paused, his voice thick with emotion. He has not spoken of anyone like that since Maggie. He had said the name. Clara heard it but let it lie. Some things are too fragile to be touched. Then let us make certain I do not have to leave, she said. Thursday was heavy with the weight of waiting, and Ezra could feel it. He always sensed when something was off, and he dealt with it the way he always did, by burying his feelings under a pile of facts. Did you know the town hall was built in 1872, he asked at breakfast. They meant for it to be a schoolhouse, but the money ran out. I read it in the records Judge Croft showed me. His spoon stopped moving. Is there something going on at the town hall? Clara and Cole shared a look. There is a meeting tomorrow, Cole said. About what? Cole did not answer. About me, Clara said gently. Ezra looked right at her, his gaze steady and wise beyond his years. Are they trying to make you go away? They are trying, Clara said. But we are not going to let them. Ezra looked down at his cereal. The folks who say mean things about you, they do not know you, he said after a moment. No, they do not, Clara agreed. He looked up, his eyes serious. They should know you bring me milk at night and make my eggs just right. They should know you sat with me when I was scared, even when Pa told you not to. He spoke carefully, building his case. Maybe they will, Clara said softly. That night, sleep would not come. She lay in the dark, replaying every warning from Bell, every word from Cole, thinking about Croft and the way a small town makes up its mind about a woman it has already condemned. She remembered her father-in-law just 2 days after they had buried his son, telling her to figure out where she was going. The house was his, he had said. She had been made to feel disposable so many times, she started to believe it was a part of her she could never shake. But then she thought of Ezra saying, I do not think you will be lonely here. She thought of Cole saying her name for the first time, like it was something important. She got up, made coffee, and sat in the dark kitchen. 20 minutes later, Cole was standing in the doorway. He looked from her to the coffee pot and sat down. She poured him a cup. I have been thinking about Ellis Hatch, Cole finally said. I have been so busy feeling guilty over what happened to him that I stopped asking the question that really mattered. He held the warm cup in his hands. Croft faked that evidence. Croft bought that land. Croft let a man rot in prison for a crime he did not commit. Cole's jaw was set like stone. I was so wrapped up in my own failure that I let Croft get away with his for 4 years. Do you have proof? Clara asked. The man who confessed in Colorado is still in prison. He named the ranches, the cattle, everything. None of it lined up with Croft's evidence. Dr. Agnes Ford wrote to the warden 8 months ago and got a copy of his confession. She has had it all this time, just waiting. Clara just stared at him. She has been holding on to that this whole time. Agnes is a very patient woman. Cole, Clara said, setting her cup down. That is more than a defense for Friday. That is a weapon. A change came over his face. I know. Does Croft know she has it? No. Clara looked at the quiet, stubborn man across from her, a man who had blamed himself for 4 years for something that was done to him. A fierce feeling rose in her chest. Then Friday does not have to be about whether I am fit for your house, she said. Friday can be about who is fit to be the moral compass for this whole town. If we do this, Croft will not just let it go. He will come at us from other directions. He is already doing that, Clara said. This way, we are the ones on the attack, not just waiting for him to strike. Cole was quiet for a long while. Outside, the wind whispered around the house. There is one more thing, he said, looking down at his cup. Whatever happens in that room, whatever they say about you or your past, I need you to know I do not believe a word of it. He paused. I have watched you every single day. I have seen you with Ezra, with the chores, and with the townsfolk who have been cruel. I know who you are. He finally looked up at her. I should have said it sooner. You are saying it now, she replied, the words settling deep inside her. They sat together in the quiet kitchen until the night began to fade to gray. Friday morning arrived, cold and bright. Clara dressed in her best dark dress, her hair pinned up with her mother's silver combs. Clara looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was tired, clear-eyed and completely done with letting folks make her feel small. When she stepped out, little Ezra was waiting in the hall, all dressed up in his good clothes. He said, "I'm coming with you." Behind him, his daddy, Cole, had the look of a man who'd already fought that battle and lost. Clara told the boy, "You don't have to do this." But Ezra stood tall and said, "I know. That's why I'm going." Well, you can't argue with that kind of grit. So they all got their coats and headed for the wagon. As they rode toward Redstone Crossing, the town hall felt like a storm cloud on the horizon. Clara could feel the weight of it, a room full of people who had already made up their minds. It was a feeling she knew all too well, the same one she got when she had to walk into those rooms full of judging eyes before. And so, she walked right into this one, too. Cole put a hand on the small of her back just for a second, a silent promise of support. Every head in that room turned to watch them. At the front, Judge Harlan Croft sat with a look of phony regret on his face, watching her like a man who thought he'd already won. He was wrong about that. The air was thick with the smell of wool and tension, the feeling of a crowd hungry for a show. They took their seats up front with Ezra sitting between her and Cole, looking as serious as the judge himself. Across the way, Clara saw a few friendly faces. Deputy Bell stood against a wall, making it clear he thought this whole thing was a bad joke. And Dr. Agnes Ford sat there, looking like a woman who was used to being underestimated. Judge Croft called the hearing to order, his voice smooth as butter. He talked about community and concern for the poor, grieving child. He made it all sound so proper and reasonable you could feel the folks in the room nodding along, ready to agree with whatever he said. He looked at Clara with practiced pity. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "please." Dorothy Vale stood up, dressed in black like she was at a funeral. She spoke about standards and moral examples, arranging her words like a house of cards, seeming sturdy but ready to fall at the slightest breath. She twisted the truth into a story where Clara was a woman of low character, living under the roof of a widower. "I say this without malice," Dorothy said, looking right at Clara. Two other women followed, their words dripping with a little more poison. They called her life inappropriate and scandalous. But Clara just sat there, refusing to flinch. When they were done, Judge Croft thanked them and turned to Cole. "Mr. Raines, you may speak." Cole stood up. He wasn't a man for public speaking, but his voice was steady and clear. "My son has not slept through the night in 14 months, he said, his words cutting through the silence. He barely ate. He was like a ghost in his own home. I tried everything, nothing worked." He paused and looked right at Clara. "Miss Whitmore has been with us for 3 weeks. Now my son sleeps, he eats, he laughs again. He's talking about books he wants to read." Cole's gaze swept across the room. "I don't need a court to tell me what's good for my child. I've been watching what's good for him for 3 weeks, and she is standing right here." A low murmur went through the crowd. But before the judge could speak, a small, clear voice cut in. "I'd like to say something." It was Ezra. He had stood up from his chair. The room went dead silent. The judge looked flustered. "Son, this isn't the place," but Ezra's voice was firm. "My name is Ezra Cole Raines. I am 7 years old, and this hearing is about me. I reckon I should be allowed to say something." Cole started to move toward him, but Clara put a hand on his arm. "Let him," she whispered. The judge, seeing all the watching eyes, knew he had no choice. "Go ahead, son." Ezra looked straight at him. "When I can't sleep, Miss Whitmore heats up milk for me. She just sits with me. She doesn't make me talk. She waits till I'm all the way asleep before she leaves." He took a breath, his little voice filling the big room. "She told me my mama was still real, even if folks stopped saying her name. She said real people don't disappear just because we get quiet." He looked over at the women who had accused Clara. "Mrs. Vale has never once asked me what I need. Judge Croft, you just give me peppermints." He looked back at Clara. "Miss Whitmore, she gives me real attention. Like what I say matters. The silence in the room was different now, heavy with truth. My mama died, Ezra said, his voice steady. I was there. I know what it looks like when somebody is really trying to help, and when somebody is just doing what they're supposed to. Miss Whitmore is trying, he said, looking straight at Croft. You are not. You are only here because you want something from my pa. I know it. You give me peppermints the same way you smile at everyone. It looks nice, but it does not mean a thing. He sat down and the room went silent. Croft's friendly expression was frozen on his face. The child is clearly attached, which is a sign of emotional... Dr. Agnes Ford stood up. She was a woman of about 50, with gray in her hair and a posture that said she had spent 30 years not apologizing for taking up space. She walked to the front, set her satchel on the table, and opened it with the calm of a woman who had waited 8 months for this exact moment. Dr. Ford, Croft said, his voice suddenly tight. This is a welfare hearing. I am a resident of this community and a doctor with knowledge of this case. Sit down, Harlan. She pulled out a document. I have here a sworn confession from the prison in Denver, Colorado. It is from a man named Dale Purvis, arrested in 1881 for cattle rustling. In his confession, he names every ranch he stole from and every man he paid off. She looked up at the silent room. He does not mention Ellis Hatch. Not one time. A murmur went through the crowd. Ellis Hatch, Agnes said loudly, was a local rancher convicted of rustling 4 years ago on evidence brought to this court by the land office. He died in prison. After he died, his wife had to sell their land, the land her family had worked for 11 years, just to pay the legal bills. She placed the document on the table. She sold it to Judge Croft for $140. Croft was on his feet. Dr. Ford, this is out of order. This is a domestic hearing, not a place for baseless claims. The evidence against Ellis Hatch was a fake bill of sale and a witness who never existed, Agnes said, her voice rising above his. I know, because I have spent 8 months looking for him. She looked around the room. I am not a lawyer. I am not here today to make a formal accusation. Today is about showing this town who really has the right to call himself a moral authority around here. She looked Judge Croft dead in the eye. And it is not this man. The room exploded with noise. Croft slammed his hand on the table, yelling that the document was hearsay, that it was an outrageous stunt. It's certified by the warden of the Denver Territorial Prison, Agnes said, her voice calm and clear. The seal is on the last page. Feel free to read it. People in the front row were already whispering to each other. Deputy Bell stood up straight, his arms uncrossed. 2 of the council members were talking fast, and the third was reading the document like a man realizing the whole world had just shifted under his feet. Clara just sat still and watched Harlan Croft. She watched him do the math in his head, counting the friends he had in the room, and realizing the number had just changed for good. She saw the calculation in his eyes. It was a cold thing to watch a man choose survival over honor. He sat, smoothed his expression, and spoke like a man trying to patch a sinking ship. The court will recess. These are serious claims, and we must not be hasty. Harlan Bell strode to the front, his gaze fixed on Croft. You want to talk about hasty? He said, his voice slow and steady. We can talk about you dragging a good woman's name through the mud based on gossip, or we can put it to a vote right here and now. A vote, Thomas Abner agreed, setting down the papers he'd been reading. He was a solid man who did not waste words. I second the motion. I have heard all I need to. A muscle jumped in Croft's jaw. Thomas, that document is... I can read, Harlan. Abner cut him off. He faced the others. All in favor of dismissing this nonsense, say aye. Aye, Abner said firmly. Aye, echoed Garrett, a younger rancher who had been keeping an eye on young Ezra. The third man, Fowler, who had been quiet all morning, looked down, then over at the boy sitting tall beside Clara. Quietly, he said, Aye. 3-2. Croft froze. Hearing is dismissed, Abner declared. The room erupted in a low rumble of surprise. Clara sat still amid the noise, a weight lifting from her soul. The world was not fair, but just then enough good people had decided to be. Cole's hand rested on her shoulder. "It is over," he said. She could only nod. Words caught in her throat. Ezra leaned against her, warm and solid. That was all the comfort she needed. Agnes Ford sat down in front of them, a knowing look on her face. "You did good," she told Clara. "So did you," Clara replied. Agnes smiled faintly. "I have had that confession since August, just waiting for the right time. Croft gave me the opening himself by calling this hearing. He is a fool. He thought this was all about you." "What happens to him now?" Clara whispered. Agnes watched Croft across the room. "That depends on the territorial court. I sent them a copy. What he did to Ellis Hatch and to Cole, that does not just disappear. Today just gave us the high ground to finally fight back." Clara saw Croft, a man who knew he had lost more than just a vote. He was already planning his next war, but smaller too. He seemed smaller now that she saw him for what he was. Deputy Bell appeared beside her, hat in his hands. He looked at Clara with a warmth that said his faith in people had been given a little boost. "Well, ma'am," he said, "I've been deputy here for 11 years, and I ain't ever seen a 7-year-old boy talk a judge down like that." "He did it himself," Clara replied. Bell looked at Ezra. "Son, what you did in there took more grit than most grown men have. Your mama would have been mighty proud." Ezra studied him. "You knew my mama?" "I did. She used to bring us coffee on cold mornings at the jail. Said a man protecting a town all night deserved something warm." Bell's voice went low. "She was a good, kind woman." "Your daddy don't talk about her much." "I know." Bell glanced over at Cole. "He loves her so much it probably still bleeds. Some wounds take a long time to scar over." He put his hat back on. "But you can ask me anything about her anytime you want." "Deal?" Ezra looked at him a long moment, then stuck out his little hand. "Deal." Bell shook it like a man. Cole heard it all. Clara saw it in the way he went still. He didn't turn around, just kept talking to Abner. But after a second, he reached down without looking and put his hand on Ezra's head. Ezra leaned right into his touch, never breaking his gaze with Bell. It was so natural, so real, that Clara had to turn away. Dorothea Vale swept past them. Her chin was high, her back was ramrod straight, like a woman who'd never admit defeat. But she paused for just a heartbeat, and her eyes met Clara's. She said nothing, but something in her face had changed. Clara just looked back, no victory in her eyes, just the simple truth of it. Dorothea walked on out. The room was clearing out. Clara stood, looking at the empty chair where she'd sat, thinking on what Ezra said. Real attention, like what I say matters. She thought of her own mama, gone when she was 12, and the awful quiet of losing the one soul who knew you best. She thought about all the rooms she had ever walked into by herself. Cole came and stood beside her. Ezra had gone outside with Bell to see about a horse. What Agnes said, Cole started. "About Hatch. I've known something was wrong for 4 years. I didn't push it. Pushing meant I'd have to look at my own part in it all, and I wasn't ready." "Are you ready now?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a bit. "I reckon I have to be." He looked at her. "This ain't over. Croft will come at us from another direction." "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't. But today was something." He looked at what Ezra did, what you did. He stopped. "It's been a long time since I had someone standing with me," he said. "I'd forgotten how it felt." Clara looked at him. "How does it feel?" Cole Raines, a man of few words and long silences, looked at her with everything on his face, open and clear. "Like maybe I can stop waiting for the other shoe to drop," he said. They walked out of the town hall together. Ezra was outside with Bell, talking a mile a minute about that horse. The mountains stood sharp and white against the sky, and the road home was clear. Clara put her hands in her pockets, feeling the days settle into a weight she could carry. It wasn't over. Croft was still here. The law still had to answer for Ellis Hatch. And this town wasn't going to change overnight just because of one vote. But she was still here. Cole was still here. And Ezra was still here, explaining to a patient deputy all about a horse's nostrils. And watching that boy's face so alive after being so brave, Clara knew that was what mattered. That was worth every hard step it took to get here. The ride home was quiet, a settled kind of quiet. Ezra sat between them, talking about the gray mare Belle had shown him. Cole drove, saying a word or two about horses when needed. Clara just sat and felt the cold air, her mind blessedly empty for the first time in ages. It was Ezra who broke the silence after a while. "Pa," he said, "are you going to do something about Judge Croft? About that man he put in jail?" Cole's hands tightened on the reins. "Yes, good." Ezra was quiet a moment. "That man's wife sold her land for $140. That ain't much." "No, son, it isn't. Somebody ought to do something. Somebody's going to," Cole promised. That seemed to be enough for Ezra. He leaned against Clara's arm, a tired little boy who'd used up all his courage for one day. Clara put her arm around him. Cole watched the road, but the hard set of his jaw softened. The next few weeks the house started to feel different. The air wasn't so heavy anymore. The people in it weren't holding their breath. Ezra slept through the night more often. Cole fixed the busted step on the porch, and he started leaving his coffee cup inside, which Clara knew meant he was planning on coming back in. She was right about Croft. He didn't quit. 2 weeks later, Belle rode out to tell them Croft had filed a complaint about the deed to Cole's land. A little paperwork problem that had never been a problem before. It meant lawyers and a trip to Cheyenne. Cole took the news like a man who'd been expecting a storm and was just learning its name. He thanked Belle and came inside. He sat at the table and didn't say a word. Clara made coffee. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Cole said. "No. Every time we block one move, he'll make another." He looked at her. "That's how he fights. He wears a man down, makes him bleed slow, until staying costs more than leaving." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not telling you to go," he said, quick. "I know that, too." He looked down at his cup. "I'm just telling you that staying means more of this. It means a long fight. This means we still have to deal with Croft, and some folks in this town will always judge you by your past." He looked her square in the eye. "I need you to know what you would be choosing." Clara looked at the man before her, the man who worked himself to the bone, who carried a guilt that was not his, and who had looked at her with a kindness she thought she would never see again. "Cole," she said softly, "I already know. I am not staying because I am stuck. I am staying because this place finally feels like home. Because of Ezra. Because when you say my name, it means something." She took a breath. "I am staying because I wake up, and I want to be right here. And that is not just something. That is about everything there is." Cole was quiet for a long, long time. The kitchen was warm against the wind outside. "I have not wanted something to work out this much since Maggie was alive," Cole said, his voice quiet and rough. It was the first time he had said her name to Clara, and she knew what a heavy thing it was for him to say. "She would be glad he is sleeping soundly," Clara said softly. "I know she would," Cole replied, his eyes meeting hers. "She would have liked you. Maggie never did care for people who played it safe." Clara gave a small smile. "That is high praise." "It is the highest I have got," he said. A few nights later, Ezra asked, "Do you think Pa is going to ask you to stay for good?" "Why do you ask, Ezra?" "Because I have been thinking," he said. "And I think you should, if he asks. I know nobody asked my opinion, but I wanted to say it." Clara paused. "Ezra, why did you stand up for me at that hearing?" He thought for a moment. "Because they were talking about me like I was not there, and because they were not telling the truth." His voice got lower. "And because you sat on my floor in the dark and you did not make me talk. You just stayed. I did not want somebody who stays to have to leave. You are a very wise young man, she said, her throat tight. I know, Ezra said simply. Mama used to say that too. When Cole came back from Cheyenne, he had news. A lawyer named Harriet Walsh had reviewed the landlord complaint. She found it was mostly hot air and filed a challenge that would keep Harlan Croft busy for months. Even better, she was getting the territorial court to review the Hatch conviction. Croft knows, Cole told them. He is scared. Good, Ezra said. The fight is not over, Cole said. I know, Ezra replied, but scared is better than comfortable. Cole looked at his son with an expression of pure love and wonder. You are right, son. Scared is much better than comfortable. It was Agnes Ford who finally settled things. She came by on a Saturday morning to check on Ezra and stayed for coffee. She looked at Cole and then at Clara. You two are extremely careful with each other, she stated. Agnes, Cole began. I am not criticizing, she said. I am just noting that being careful can become permanent if you let it, and that is a terrible way to spend a life. This is not your business, Cole said. No, Agnes agreed pleasantly. It is not. After she left, the kitchen was silent. Clara felt a laugh trying to escape. When she looked up, Cole was watching her, and he was done pretending. She is not wrong, he said. No, she is not. Cole stood and walked to the window, looking out into the yard. Clara waited. She had learned that Cole Raines needed a moment between a decision and his words. He turned around. I have been alone for 14 months, he said. Not just without Maggie. Alone in a way that means nobody in the world knows who you really are. You have been here 7 weeks, and you know more of the whole picture than anyone. That is because you see things clearly, and you do not look away from them. He paused. That is a rare thing. Let me finish. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and Clara stood too. I loved Maggie. I will always have loved Maggie. That does not end. But loving her does not mean I am finished. It means I know what love is worth. He took a breath. I want you to stay, not as part of an arrangement. I want you to stay as mine, as ours. He glanced at Ezra, who was watching them with wide eyes. Clara June Whitmore, Cole said, her full name a serious, deliberate thing. I am asking you to marry me. I am asking, knowing your past and not giving a single damn about anyone's opinion of it. I am asking because you are the bravest person I have ever known. And because when I came back from Cheyenne yesterday and saw the light in the kitchen window from the road, I felt something I have not felt in 14 months. I felt like I was going home. The kitchen was completely silent. Ezra held his book to his chest, his eyes wide. Clara looked at this man of careful silences who had trusted her completely. She thought of every lonely room she had ever left. And then she thought about being the reason a light was on. Yes, she said. Cole, yes? Ezra let out a sound that was half cheer and half pure satisfaction. I told her you were going to ask, he announced. Go outside, Cole said, grinning. Ezra, smiling so hard he did not see where he was going, walked right into the doorframe. Cole took both of Clara's hands in his. Model. His hands, weathered by years of hard Texas work, held hers gently but with a firm promise. I ain't got a ring, he said, his voice low. My words came out better than my plan. The words were plenty good, Clara told him. I'll fetch you one from town. No need to rush. I believe there is, he said, his gaze steady and sure. For a good while now. You walked in here with just one trunk, yet you remade this whole place just by being you. That's not something a man lets walk away. Clara looked at him, feeling 7 weeks of uncertainty settle into something as solid as the ground beneath their feet. They married 6 weeks later on the ranch house porch. Reverend Aldous from Redstone Crossing said the words, with Agnes Ford and Belle standing witness. Even Councilman Thomas Abner, who had once stood against her, attended with his family. Dorothy the Vale sent a jar of preserved plums with a simple note. Congratulations, Mrs. Raines. From her, that was as good as a public apology. Ezra held the ring serious as a judge. When the Reverend finished, Ezra looked right at Clara with his old soul eyes and said what he always knew. "I knew it. I know you did," she smiled. "Can I call you Mama now?" he had asked before, but this time was official in front of everybody. Clara knelt down in her wedding dress, taking his small face in her hands. She looked at this boy who had bravely spoken the truth to a room full of grown-ups. She said, "You can call me Mama every single day for the rest of your life, and it will mean the world to me each time." Ezra hugged her tight, like a boy who had finally found home and wasn't about to let go. Cole's hand rested on her shoulder, warm and constant, just as it had on their worst day. She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of the woman who had first arrived in Redstone Crossing, carrying one trunk and a heart made hollow by people telling her she was not enough. She remembered what it took to stay, the cruel words, and the cold, lonely nights, where she had nothing but her own stubborn will. She thought on all of it, and then she let it drift away. It all happened, but it led her here, to this porch, this man, and this child. Life was not perfect, and the road ahead was still rough, but it was hers. Agnes Ford had told her once, "Smart folks stop waiting for the world to tell them they are worthy and decide it for themselves." Clara had stopped waiting a long time ago. She was home. She was loved. She was made of the same tough stuff as the women in her family who crossed mountains without complaint. And it turned out that was more than enough. It was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.